Welcome, my friend, to the warmth of Baker Street Ember. Settle in by the fire.
As we prepare for tonight's tale, I must ask, from which shadowy corner of the world are you listening? If you find comfort here, please subscribe and leave a like to support the channel. Now,
London fog pressed thick against the windows of 221B Baker Street. Inside, Holmes sat motionless, starved for intellectual challenge. Then came the knock, the telegram, the case. Sir Reginald Hargrove found dead at his Mayfair residence, poisoned, with a suicide note clutched in his rigid hand. Scotland Yard saw despair and self-destruction, but Holmes saw an ember, the signature's subtle tremor, absent from the man's steady script, a spark that would ignite the truth. From Baker Street, the fire spreads. Chapter 1. The first spark. I find myself once again setting pen to paper to record the events that unfolded in the bitter November of 1892, when the fog of London lay so thick upon the city that gas lamps burned like dying stars along the streets. Inside 221B Baker Street, the coal fire crackled steadily in the grate, throwing warm light across the scattered papers, the chemical apparatus, the Persian slipper stuffed with shag tobacco, and my friend Sherlock Holmes, who lounged in his mouse-colored dressing gown, eyes half closed in boredom. The 17 steps to our door had grown quiet of late. No interesting crime had disturbed the peace, and Holmes had taken to playing melancholy airs upon his Stradivarius until even Mrs. Hudson's patient knock sounded weary. That morning the fog pressed damp against the window panes, carrying with it the mingled smells of Thames mud, horse manure from the hansom cabs below, and the faint metallic bite of coal smoke. I was sipping strong, bitter tea, MRS. Hudson's brew, when her familiar rap came at the door, followed by the soft rustle of a telegram being slid beneath. Holmes leapt up with sudden energy, the languor vanishing as though a match had been struck. He tore open the yellow envelope, scanned the lines, and his eyes acquired that peculiar bright gleam I have come to associate with the scent of a fresh chase. "Watson," he said, voice low and eager, "the game begins." The telegram was from Inspector Lestrade. Sir Reginald Hargrove, the wealthy collector of rare manuscripts, had been found dead that very morning in the locked library of his Mayfair residence. A vial of poison stood upon the desk beside his rigid hand. In the other he clutched a single sheet of paper, a suicide note bearing his own signature, and a brief confession of ruinous gambling debts. "Scotland Yard," Lestrade wrote with characteristic confidence, "consider the matter closed. A gentleman broken by misfortune had chosen the gentleman's way out." Holmes read the message twice, then folded it with deliberate care. A locked room, poison, a note in the dead man's hand. Elementary, one might suppose. Yet I smell something else entirely. He reached for his pipe, drew deeply, and let the strong tobacco smoke curl upward to mingle with the coal fumes. "Come, Watson, we shall see what embers glow in that library." We took a hansom cab through the fog-choked streets. The wheels clattered over wet cobblestones. The horse's breath steamed in the chill. The driver's whip cracked like distant gunfire. By the time we reached the elegant Mayfair Terrace, the air inside the house was heavy with gaslight fumes, old leather bindings, carbolic soap from recent cleaning, and the unmistakable sour metallic undertone that every medical man recognizes as the aftermath of cyanide. Sir Reginald lay slumped across his mahogany desk, tweed coat dusted with gritty soot from the fireplace, one sleeve caught on the inkwell. The suicide note rested beneath fingers already stiffening. Lestrade stood nearby, arms folded, smug in his certainty. "Clear case, Mr. Holmes," he said. "Note poison, locked door from the inside. No forced entry. The man took his own life." Holmes said nothing at first. He merely knelt beside the body, examined the boots, rough country leather caked with reddish clay mixed with coal dust, then rose and lifted the note to the hissing gas lamp. I confess I saw nothing remarkable in the handwriting. The signature was recognizably Sir Reginald's. The tall loop on the R, the sharp cross of the H. Yet Holmes held the paper closer, eyes narrowing. "A small ember, Watson," he murmured, "but it glows with meaning." He pointed to the final signature line, where Sir Reginald's hand had always been firm, and even in the dozens of letters and receipts I had later examined, this signature showed a subtle, unnatural tremor, a wavering pressure, exaggerated loops, ink blotted in one place as though the pen had hesitated. The rest of the note was written in a steady, flowing script. Only the name faltered. "This is no tremor of despair," Holmes said softly. "This is the tremor of imitation. You, dear reader, may already have guessed what I did not. Looking back now, the clue was obvious. But at the time I stood puzzled while Holmes continued. He turned to the desk, noted a missing button from the victim's cuff, threadbare edge recently torn, and a faint trace of gunpowder smudged near the inkwell, though no firearm was present in the room. He scraped a speck of reddish mud from the carpet near the hearth and rubbed it between thumb and forefinger. "Whitechapel clay," he said, "mixed with coal dust and copper filings. Not the sort of soil one finds on Mayfair carpets unless carried there deliberately." Lestrade snorted. "The man walked in the fog, Mr. Holmes. Mud gets everywhere." "Indeed," Holmes replied, "but not this particular mud, and not on the library carpet when the body was discovered before the housemaid had time to sweep." He paced before the fire, rapid steps echoing on the polished floorboards. Then he returned to the note. The ember method unfolded before me as clearly as the flames in the grate. The spark, the signature's tremor, absent in every verified specimen of Sir Reginald's writing from the past 6 months. The kindling. Forgery under pressure produces exactly this hesitation. The imitator mimics form, but cannot capture the unconscious rhythm of the original hand. The flame. I recalled the affair of the Musgrave ritual, where a forged document nearly deceived an entire family. The criminal's hand, though skilled, betrayed itself in the varying pressure of the pen, just as a man's footprints betray his path even when his words lie. That forger believed antiquity would shield him. This one believed a locked door would suffice. The blaze. Sir Reginald Hargrove did not write this note, nor did he take his own life. Someone else poisoned him, arranged the scene, and forged the signature to suggest suicide. The ember catches fire, Watson. Do you see it? Do you see it, dear listener? We spoke briefly with the household. Lady Hargrove, pale and composed in the drawing room, smelled faintly of lavender water and grief. The nephew Edmund, dissolute and red-eyed, reeked of cheap cigarettes. Miss Eliza Thorne, the secretary, answered questions with calm precision, her gloves smooth against rough tweed. Mr. Victor Langdale, the business rival, had left angry words the previous day. The maid Annie whispered of late-night footsteps. Holmes listened, noted, said little. As we stepped back into the fog, the rain began, soft patter on the handsome roof, mixing with the scent of wet wool and horse sweat. Holmes drew once more on his pipe, smoke culling into the dim interior. 2 embers already glow, he said. The forged signature and the Whitechapel mud. From these small sparks we shall light the whole truth. The first embers glowed in the darkness. The fire of truth had begun. Chapter 2. Gathering kindling. The fog of London refused to lift on the second day of our inquiry, wrapping the city in a grey chill that made every breath taste of damp wool and coal smoke. I set these lines down in my journal at 221B Baker Street, where the coal fire burned steadily in the grate, sending warmth against the icy draught that slipped under the door. Holmes had risen early, already dressed, and was pacing before the hearth with rapid steps, the 17 wooden stairs creaking faintly each time Mrs. Hudson passed below. "Kindling must be gathered, Watson," he declared, pausing only to draw deeply on his pipe. The strong shag tobacco curled in blue wreaths. blending with the faint gaslight fumes that still lingered from the night. A single ember may smolder alone, but add fuel and the flames spread. We began at Sir Reginald Hargrove's club in Pall Mall, a place of polished mahogany and hushed voices where gentlemen of means gathered under the hiss of gas jets. The air inside carried the rich scent of Turkish tobacco mingled with old leather and the sharp bite of brandy. Mr. Victor Langdale, Sir Reginald's business rival and a frequent visitor to the reading room, received us with guarded courtesy. He admitted the recent quarrel over a disputed Shakespeare folio, a matter of principle, nothing more, but insisted he had dined here the previous evening until well past 10. His cuff bore a fresh ink stain, dark and still tacky. Holmes noted it without comment, but his eyes gleamed. "A small ember, Watson," he murmured as we left, "but it glows with meaning." Did you catch its glow? From Pall Mall we took a hansom cab eastward, the wheels rattling over wet cobblestones while the horses who splashed through shallow puddles, smelling of manure and rain. We reached Edmund Hargrove's lodgings in a narrow Soho street, a third-floor set of rooms above a noisy public house. The nephew opened the door himself, bleary-eyed, reeking of cheap cigarettes and last night's gin. His threadbare dressing gown hung loosely. His hand shook as he lit another cigarette. He claimed to have spent the fatal evening at a gambling club in Leicester Square, but when pressed could produce no witness who remembered him after 9 o'clock. The room itself was squalid, gritty soot on the windowsill, damp newspaper crumpled in the grate, a faint sweetish trace of opium lingering in the curtains. Holmes knelt briefly, scraped a speck of reddish clay from the sole of a boot left carelessly by the door, and rubbed it between thumb and forefinger. "Whitechapel again," he said quietly. "The same peculiar mixture of clay, coal dust, and copper filings. This detail smolders. It will ignite something larger." Edmund laughed, too loudly. "My uncle's death has nothing to do with me. He was going to cut me off anyway." We left him there, cigarette smoke trailing behind us down the dark stairwell. Our next call was to Miss Eliza Thorne, the late baronet's private secretary. She received us in a modest tea shop near the British Museum, a place of worn wooden tables and the comforting smell of fresh scones and strong coffee. Miss Thorne was neatly dressed in rough tweed, her gloves smooth against the chipped china cup she held. She answered questions with calm precision. She had typed Sir Reginald's correspondence for 3 years, managed his manuscript acquisitions, and prepared drafts of his will. She denied any knowledge of forgery, yet when Holmes asked to see samples of her own handwriting, she hesitated for the fraction of a second. The loops in her signature were elegant, almost theatrical, too close in exaggeration to the wavering flourish on the suicide note. I invite you, dear reader, to pause here. What would you deduce from that single moment of hesitation? Back in the cab, Holmes spoke softly. The careful listener will have already noticed the inconsistency. Her script is controlled, deliberate. The note's signature is hurried, forced. Two hands, Watson, two very different stories. Lady Hargrove we visited last, in the same Mayfair drawing room where yesterday she had sat pale and silent. Today she wore black bombazine, the faint scent of lavender water and carbolic soap still clinging to her. She spoke of her husband's recent melancholy, of arguments over money, of a locket she wore containing the portrait of a younger man, Victor Langdale in his university days. An old attachment, she admitted, but nothing more. Her alibi was firm. She had spent the evening with her sister in Kensington, returning by hansom after midnight. Yet Holmes noted a small tear in the hem of her skirt, fresh mud still clinging, reddish clay again. "You walked somewhere in the fog last night, Lady Hargrove," he observed gently. She flushed, merely to clear my head. The maid Annie we questioned briefly in the servants' hall below stairs. The air there smelled of boiled cabbage, carbolic soap, and coal settling in the small grate. Annie's hands were rough from work, her apron coarse and patched. She whispered that she had heard raised voices between Sir Reginald and Mr. Langdale 2 days earlier, and that Mr. Edmund had slipped into the house through the area door after 11 on the night of the death. Thought nothing of it at first, sir, she said. Young gentlemen keep odd hours. Holmes thanked her with unusual gentleness and slipped a half-sovereign into her palm. By late afternoon we returned to Baker Street. The rain had begun again, drumming softly against the window panes. Holmes spread the collected fragments across the table. A scraping of reddish mud, a photograph of the suicide note under magnification, ink samples from Sir Reginald's desk, a torn cuff button found near the body, and Miss Thorne's hastily written specimen page. He performed a quick chemical test on the ink of the note, apparatus bubbling with faint acrid fumes, and compared it to the household supply. The note's ink is fresher, manufactured within the last month. Sir Reginald's bottle is 6 months old. Another ember. He paced once more. Pipe, smoke culling. Liza kindling. Watson. Truth is the match. We have gathered enough fuel now. I confess the pattern was beginning to form in my mind, though still shadowy. You, dear listener, may have already seen what I was only beginning to glimpse. The kindling was gathered, smoke rising. The flames approached. Chapter 3. The Smoulder. As I continue this narrative in my journal, the events of that foggy November week in 1892 grow clearer in retrospect, though at the time they remained shrouded in uncertainty and half-lit suspicion. The bitter cold still gripped London. Each morning the windows of 221B Baker Street were rimed with frost, and the coal fire in our grate burned day and night to keep the chill at bay. The smell of damp wool from our overcoats mingled with the sharp tobacco scent of Holmes' pipe, and the faint acrid bite of chemicals from his experiments. Holmes had begun connecting the scattered embers we had gathered. He spread a large map of London across the table, pinning small markers at Mayfair, Soho, Whitechapel, and the Reform Club in Pall Mall. His steepled fingers rested beneath his chin as he studied the pattern. The mud tells its own story, Watson, he said quietly. Reddish clay mixed with coal dust and copper filings, found only in the narrow streets surrounding the old Whitechapel foundries where copper is still worked by hand. Edmund Hargrove's boot carried exactly that mixture. Yet he claims he never left Soho on the night in question. We returned to Whitechapel that afternoon. The fog was thicker here, almost soup-like, carrying the heavy odor of river mud, horse manure, and the metallic tang of forge smoke. The ground beneath our boots was frozen hard, gritty with soot and cinders. Every step crunched like walking on coarse sand. We found the pawnbroker Edmund had been known to visit, a dingy shop with worn leather counters and shelves of tarnished silver. The proprietor, a thin man with yellowed fingers from cheap cigarettes, remembered the young gentleman clearly. Came in 3 days before the baronet died, he said. Bought a small glass vial, said it was for medicine, paid with a sovereign, and didn't wait for change. Holmes purchased a similar vial for examination later. As we left, he scraped another sample of the reddish clay from the doorstep. This smoulders, Watson. It will ignite something larger. Back in Baker Street, Holmes turned his attention to the missing button found near Sir Reginald's desk. Under the magnifying lens, the thread was not ordinary wool, but a fine French twist used only in high-quality tailoring, and recently treated with chalk dust to mark alterations. Such chalk, Holmes explained, was employed in manuscript restoration rooms to prevent ink from bleeding. Sir Reginald's library contains several jars of it. Miss Thorne's handwriting samples lay beside the suicide note. When placed under strong light, the loops in her own script showed the same slight exaggeration under pressure as the forged signature. Holmes performed a simple ink test. The note's ink contained a trace of modern aniline dye not present in Sir Reginald's older stock. The ember method revealed itself once more, bright and unmistakable. The spark, the button's thread, frayed at the break, embedded with fine white chalk dust of a precise French variety. The kindling, That chalk is used exclusively in the delicate work of manuscript repair. Only 3 people in the household had regular access to it: Sir Reginald himself, Miss Thorne, and occasionally the maid when cleaning. The flame. This recalled to my mind the adventure of the Blue Carbuncle, where a gentleman's hat, lost and found, betrayed its owner through wax drippings, dust of neglect, and the elastic's unusual wear. The criminal had believed London's anonymity would protect him, yet the most trivial details of grooming and habits spoke louder than any alibi. That hat told of late nights reading by candlelight, of a household in decline, of a man who had fallen from comfort into desperation, much as this button whispered of someone who had been in the library after hours, close enough to the desk to lose a fastening in struggle or haste. The blaze. Miss Thorne was present in the library on the night of the murder, not at home as she claimed. The chalk dust places her at the scene. The button proves physical contact near the body. The ember catches fire. Watson, do you see it? Do you see it, dear listener? Lady Hargrove's locket we had glimpsed only briefly before. Today Holmes requested to examine it more closely. She consented with trembling fingers. Inside was indeed Victor Langdale in youth, hair dark and eyes bright. An old romance, perhaps rekindled? Yet her alibi remained solid. Her sister in Kensington confirmed the visit, and the handsome driver remembered the fare. A small red herring flickered and died. The gunpowder trace on the desk proved to be residue from a child's firework. Annie admitted she had bought some at a street stall the week before and carried them in her apron pocket when dusting. Irrelevant, Holmes declared, though it briefly distracted Lestrade. Edmund's gambling debts were confirmed by telegram from a club in Leicester Square, debts large enough to ruin him if his uncle carried out the threat to disinherit. Opium traces in the purchased file matched the sweetish scent we had noticed in his rooms. Holmes paced before the fire, pipe smoke curling upward like incense. The smoulder builds. Contradictions multiply. Miss Thorne's presence, Edmund's mud, the forged signature, all point inward, yet the motive remains shared. I confess I felt the heat of approaching revelation, though the full pattern still eluded me. You, dear reader, may have noticed what I overlooked. The way the chalk dust on the button matched exactly the powder on Miss Thorne's gloves when we met her in the tea shop. Reflection. Looking back, that tiny ember of the signature's tremor was the first true light in the fog. It reminded me of the case of the stockbroker's clerk, where forged letters nearly swindled an innocent man. There, too, the slant and pressure of the pen revealed brothers working in concert, a detail unnoticed by bankers and police alike. Observation is everything, dear listener. The world rushes past in haste, but he who pauses to fan the smallest ember often finds the blaze that illuminates all. In your own life, what smoldering detail have you passed by without a second glance? The maid Annie, when questioned again, added one final piece. She had seen Miss Thorne leave the library by the side door at 10:30, carrying a folded paper. Class distinctions were stark. Annie's threadbare apron and rough hands against the smooth gloves and measured tones of those above stairs. Yet it was the servant who saw what the gentry concealed. Holmes set the map aside and leaned back, eyes gleaming in the firelight. From such small embers, conflagrations grow. Chapter 4. Fanning the flames. The fog of London had thinned to a pale veil by the afternoon of the 3rd day, yet the chill remained sharp enough to sting the lungs with every breath of Thames-scented air. I record these lines in my journal at 221B Baker Street, where the coal fire snapped and hissed in the grate, throwing shifting shadows across the chemical apparatus and the scattered papers that seemed to multiply with each hour of the case. Holmes had grown restless. The languor of earlier days was gone, replaced by a coiled energy that made the very air in the room feel charged. False trails must be burned away, Watson, he said, reaching for his Persian slipper and stuffing fresh shag into his pipe. We fan the flames now, gently at first, then with purpose. Our first move was surveillance. Holmes, disguised in rough tweed and a battered cap pulled low, slipped out into the streets to shadow Edmund Hargrove. I followed at a discreet distance, my military bearing helping me blend among the clerks and labourers. We tracked the nephew to a narrow court off Whitechapel High Street, where the air reeked of forged smoke, cheap gin, and the sweetish undertone of opium dens. Edmund entered a low doorway marked only by a faded green lantern. Minutes later he emerged with a small paper packet clutched in his gloved hand. Holmes waited until the young man had gone, then stepped forward and purchased an identical packet from the same apothecary. A thin, nervous man with stained fingers. Later chemical analysis at Baker Street confirmed the contents. A refined preparation of laudanum laced with cyanide in minute but lethal quantity, enough to kill quickly and quietly. Holmes murmured, eyes gleaming in the firelight. This ember burns hot. We returned to Mayfair that evening for the first direct pressure. Mr. Victor Langdale had been summoned to Sir Reginald's house by telegram. He arrived in a hansom cab, stepping down with the air of a man who believed himself above suspicion. In the drawing room, its polished mahogany furniture gleaming under gas lamps that hissed softly, Holmes confronted him without preamble. "Your cuff bears fresh ink, Mr. Langdale. The same shade as the suicide note, and the locket Lady Hargrove wears contains your portrait from 20 years ago. An old flame, perhaps rekindled in secret?" Langdale flushed, the color rising beneath his starched collar. "Preposterous. I dined at the Reform Club. Witnesses will confirm it. Witnesses who left before 10 o'clock. Holmes replied calmly. "After which you walked to Mayfair through the fog. Your boots still carry traces of Whitechapel clay, though you attempted to clean them. Copper filings in the tread, sir. A careless oversight," Langdale blustered, but the flame of his confidence flickered. He departed shaken, promising to produce further proof of his whereabouts. Holmes watched him go, then turned to me. A false fire dying already. He quarrelled with Sir Reginald, yes, but over manuscripts, not murder. Next came Miss Eliza Thorne. We called at her modest Bloomsbury lodgings unannounced. The landlady's parlour smelled of boiled cabbage and carbolic soap. The stairs creaked under our boots. Miss Thorne received us in a small sitting room, its threadbare carpet and damp newspapers on the windowsill speaking of genteel poverty. Her hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as she poured tea. Holmes laid the button on the table between them, the very button found near the body, its French thread still bearing chalk dust. "You were in the library after 10 o'clock, he said quietly. "This button proves it. The chalk matches the jars on Sir Reginald's shelves. You lost it in struggle, or in haste while arranging the scene." She paled, the cup rattling against its saucer. I only went to fetch a document he requested earlier. I left before anything happened. Yet your handwriting matches the exaggerated loops of the forged signature," Holmes continued. "Pressure marks identical under magnification. You wrote the note, Miss Thorne. The question is why?" Tears welled, but she said nothing more. We left her there, the gas lamp flickering as though sharing her distress. Lady Hargrove we questioned again in the same drawing room, now lit only by the fire. The room felt stuffy despite the open window letting in the icy wind. She admitted the old attachment to Langdale, but swore it had never been renewed. Her alibi held. Her sister's servant confirmed the Kensington visit, but Holmes noted a small inconsistency. The handsome fare receipt showed a detour past Whitechapel. "A walk to clear your head, you said," Holmes observed. "Yet the mud on your hem matches Edmund's boots. You met someone there, Lady Hargrove, perhaps to deliver a warning or a payment." She denied it fiercely, but her composure cracked. The locket she still wore seemed suddenly heavy about her neck. The maid Annie provided the final spark of the evening. In the servants' hall, amid the smell of coal settling and wet wool drying by the small grate, She confessed she had seen Miss Thorne and Edmund speaking in whispers near the area door 2 nights before the murder. They didn't know I was there, sir, but I heard him say, "It's the only way." Holmes nodded gravely. Thank you, Annie. Your eyes have seen what others missed. Back at Baker Street, Holmes paced before the fire, pipe smoke culling in lazy spirals. He reviewed the embers aloud. Edmund's poison packet, Miss Thorne's button and handwriting, the Whitechapel mud on multiple boots, Lady Hargrove's detour, Langdale's weak alibi. Some flames guttered out. Langdale's rivalry now seemed mere business animosity, but others burned brighter, hotter. I confess the pattern was emerging for me at last, though still incomplete. You, dear listener, may have already pieced together 3 observations: the mud, the button, the ink, and seen where they point. Holmes saw it instantly. How long before you did? He stopped pacing, eyes alight. The false fires are dying. The true flame grows stronger. Some flames died. Others grew stronger. Chapter 5. The fire catches. By the 4th day of our inquiry, the November fog had begun to thin at last, allowing pale sunlight to pierce the London streets and cast long, uncertain shadows across the cobblestones. I set these words down in my journal at 221B Baker Street, where the coal fire burned with steady vigor, its warmth a welcome contrast to the icy wind that still rattled the window panes. The smell of fresh ink from my pen mingled with the lingering tobacco smoke from Holmes' pipe, and the faint metallic tang of the chemicals he had used the night before. Holmes had risen before dawn. When I entered the sitting room, he was already at the table, the suicide note and various specimens spread before him under the strong light of the gas lamp. His eyes held a peculiar, bright intensity I knew so well, the moment when scattered embers suddenly flare into unmistakable flame. "The pattern is complete, Watson," he said without preamble. "Tonight we shall confront them. The fire has cooled. Nothing can extinguish it now." Our first destination was Sir Reginald's library once more. Lestrade met us there at dusk, grumbling about another of your theatrical evenings, Mr. Holmes, but he had brought the suspects as requested. The room felt smaller than before, the air thick with the scents of old leather bindings, gas fumes, polished mahogany, and the underlying sourness of death that no amount of carbolic soap could entirely erase. The gas lamps hissed softly. The fire in the grate crackled as though impatient for revelation. Lady Hargrove sat rigid in an armchair, black bombazine rustling with every breath. Edmund Hargrove lounged against a bookcase, a tempting nonchalance, though his fingers trembled as he lit a cheap cigarette. Miss Eliza Thorne stood near the desk, gloves smooth, face pale but composed. Mr. Victor Langdale occupied a corner chair, arms folded, still protesting his innocence. Annie the maid waited discreetly by the door, her coarse apron tied tight, eyes wide with the knowledge that servants often see more than their employers realize. Holmes began without flourish. He lifted the suicide note to the light. "The signature is a forgery," he stated plainly. "The tremor, the exaggerated loops, the inconsistent pressure, all betray Miss Thorne's hand under stress. She wrote it after the fact." Miss Thorne gave a small, involuntary gasp. Her composure cracked like thin ice. Holmes turned to Edmund. "You procured the poison, a cyanide-laced laudanum preparation purchased in Whitechapel 3 days before the death. The vial's residue matches the sweetish trace we found in your lodgings and on the desk here. You administered it in a glass of brandy your uncle habitually took at 10 o'clock. The watch on his wrist stopped at precisely 10:17, crystal cracked from the convulsion of his final moments, not from a fall." Edmund's cigarette fell to the carpet. He made no move to retrieve it. The ember method blazed forth in its fullest form. The spark, the watch, its hands frozen at 10:17, the minute hand slightly bent from violent spasm, the crystal bearing a single hairline fracture not present in photographs taken of Sir Reginald 2 days earlier. The kindling, Cyanide kills in minutes with violent convulsions. The body would have slumped forward, striking the desk hard enough to crack the crystal, but not to shatter it completely. Suicide victims rarely convulse so dramatically unless interrupted mid-act. The flame. This recalled to me the dreadful business of the Speckled Band, where a timed mechanism masked murder as accident. There, too, the criminal relied on precision of the moment, yet overlooked the telltale signs of struggle, the bent ventilator, the saucer of milk, the whistle in the night. That murderer believed science and silence would protect him. Here, Edmund believed a forged note and a locked door would suffice. Both forgot that the body itself testifies when words lie. The blaze. Sir Reginald was poisoned at 10:15 by Edmund, who slipped into the library through the side door Miss Thorne had left unlocked. Miss Thorne then forged the note and arranged the scene while the body still sat warm at the desk. The locked door was bolted from inside by Edmund before he exited the same way. The ember catches fire. Watson, do you see it? Do you see it, dear listener? Miss Thorne broke first. Tears streamed down her face as she sank into a chair. He promised me. He said we would marry once the inheritance came. I only wrote the note to protect him. I never meant. Edmund snarled. Be quiet, Eliza. But the flame had spread too far. Lestrade stepped forward, handcuffs ready. Lady Hargrove rose, trembling but composed. Then my husband was murdered for money, and for love twisted into something vile. Langdale, who had remained silent, now spoke. I quarrelled with Sir Reginald over the folio, nothing more. I never wished him harm. Holmes inclined his head. Your innocence was never truly in doubt, sir. The Whitechapel mud on your boots came from a morning walk to retrieve a rare book from a dealer. Nothing sinister. Annie from the doorway added softly, I heard them arguing by the area door, sir. Mr. Edmund said, it has to look like he did it himself. I was afraid to speak before. Holmes turned to the group. 3 observations were always before us. The Whitechapel mud carried into this room by boots not belonging to the victim, the button-bearing French chalk from the restoration jars, and the forged signature whose tremor no despair could explain. Before I spoke, what would you have deduced from the mud, the watch, and the missing button? The evidence was there, plain for any observant mind. Lestrade shook his head in reluctant admiration. I'll be damned if I saw it. Edmund lunged suddenly toward the door, but Lestrade's men were quicker. Miss Thorne buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly. The room fell silent save for the crackle of the fire and the soft hiss of the gas lamps. The blaze had caught fully now. Every shadow stood revealed. Lady Hargrove looked at Holmes with something like awe. You have given me justice and truth. Holmes merely inclined his head. Truth is its own fire, madam. It burns away everything else. As we stepped out into the night, the fog had cleared enough to show stars above the rooftops of Mayfair. The cold air tasted clean after the stuffy library. Holmes drew deeply on his pipe, smoke curling upward like the last wisps of a dying false trail. The fire had caught, he said softly. No stopping it now. Chapter 6. Spreading blaze. The revelation in Sir Reginald Hargrove's library had set the blaze alight, and now it spread through the fog-bound streets of London with relentless speed. I continue this account in my journal on the evening of the 5th day, November 1892, seated once more by the crackling coal fire at 221B Baker Street. The room smelled of warm shag tobacco, fresh ink from my pen, and the faint sweet trace of brandy Holmes had poured to steady our nerves after the arrests. Outside, the distant fog horns on the Thames sounded like mournful confessions carried on the icy wind. Edmund Hargrove and Miss Eliza Thorne had been taken into custody at Scotland Yard that very afternoon. Lestrade, for once generous in defeat, allowed Holmes and me to attend the preliminary questioning in a small, stuffy interview room lit by a single hissing gas lamp. The air there carried the mingled odors of carbolic soap, damp wool from the prisoner's coat, and the metallic undertone of fierce sweat. Edmund sat handcuffed to the chair, defiance crumbling into sullen silence. Miss Thorne, opposite him, wept quietly into a damp handkerchief, her smooth gloves now creased and stained. Holmes stood near the barred window, steepled fingers beneath his chin, listening more than speaking. It was Miss Thorne who broke the deeper silence first. "I loved him," she whispered, voice cracking. "Edmund promised we would marry once the inheritance came. Sir Reginald had discovered our attachment. He was going to alter the will again, leave everything to charity rather than see it squandered on gambling and dissipation. Edmund said there was only one way to prevent it." She described the plan in halting sentences. Edmund would procure the poison from his Whitechapel contact, slip into the library through the side door she had left unlocked, and administer it in Sir Reginald's evening brandy. She would return later, forge the note in haste, and bolt the door from inside before slipping out the same way. The tremor in her hand, she admitted, came from terror, not grief. "I never meant for him to die so violently," she said. "I thought the note would make it seem peaceful. I only wanted us to be free." Edmund glared at her. "You fool, you've ruined us both." Holmes spoke then, voice low and calm. "The blaze illuminates what has long been hidden, Mr. Hargrove. Greed and twisted affection were the fuel, fear and forgery the kindling. But the body itself testified against you. The stopped watch, the cracked crystal, the traces of cyanide in the glass. No suicide convulses so fiercely." Lady Hargrove arrived later at Scotland Yard, escorted by her sister. She had removed the locket containing Victor Langdale's portrait. It now rested in her reticule like a closed chapter. She looked at Miss Thorne with something between pity and contempt. "My husband was not perfect," she said quietly. "He could be cold, preoccupied with his manuscripts. But he did not deserve this." Victor Langdale, summoned as a witness, confirmed what we had already suspected. His quarrel with Sir Reginald had been bitter but confined to business. The folio in dispute had been returned to him that very morning by messenger. Proof he had no further motive. The Whitechapel mud on his boots, he explained with wry embarrassment, came from a hurried visit to a bookseller near the Foundries. "I should have cleaned them properly," he admitted. Holmes merely inclined his head. The red herring had burned itself out. Annie the maid, promoted now to temporary housekeeper, gave her final statement with surprising poise. Her rough hands were clasped tightly in her lap, but her voice was steady. "I heard them planning it near the area door," she repeated. "Emma," Edmund said, "it has to look like suicide or we'll both hang," Miss Thorne answered. "I'll write the note. Just make sure it's quick." I was too frightened to speak then, but truth burns brighter than fear. Holmes turned to me as we left the yard. "Class barriers hide many things, Watson, but they cannot extinguish observation. The servants saw what the gentry concealed." Back at Baker Street, the fire had been built high. Holmes lounged in his armchair, pipe smoke curling lazily toward the ceiling. He plucked absently at the Stradivarius strings, producing a soft, meditative air that seemed to calm the room itself. Reflection came unbidden as I watched the flames dance in the grate. That first small ember, the tremor in the forged signature, had seemed so trivial when we found it. Yet it had led us here, through mud and chalk dust, buttons and stopped watches, to the heart of a conspiracy born of desperation and misplaced love. It reminded me powerfully of the Greek interpreter case, where a single coerced signature on a document had nearly doomed an innocent woman to lifelong imprisonment. There, too, the handwriting's unnatural pressure had betrayed coercion. Here, the tremor betrayed forgery under guilt. In both instances, the criminal mind believed that small physical details would be overlooked amid grander deceptions. They never are. Observation, dear listener, is the match that lights the ember. The world rushes past in fog and haste, eyes fixed on the obvious: wealth, position, apparent motive. while the ground beneath our feet remembers every step, every careless fingerprint, every wavering line of ink. Cultivate the habit of seeing. Pause when others hurry. Fan the smallest glow, and you may yet illuminate shadows others never knew existed. What ember in your own life have you allowed to smolder unnoticed? Holmes set the violin aside and reached for the brandy decanter. He poured 2 glasses. The sweet liquid caught the firelight like molten gold. "The blaze has spread," he said softly. "Every shadow stands revealed. Lady Hargrove would inherit the estate, though she had already announced her intention to donate much of the manuscript collection to the British Museum. Langdale had sent a note of thanks and an invitation to dine once the scandal faded. Annie would remain in service, her position secured, and her wages raised. Edmund and Miss Thorne faced the gallows or transportation. Justice, though slow, moved inexorably now. I looked across at my friend, his face half in shadow, half in firelight. For once he seemed almost at peace. "The truth blazed forth," I said quietly. Holmes raised his glass in a small salute, and nothing remained hidden. The blaze illuminated what had long been hidden in shadow. Chapter 7. The Conflagration. I write these final lines of the active investigation in my journal on the 6th day of November 1892, seated once more by the coal fire at 221B Baker Street. The room glows with steady warmth. The grate crackles as fresh lumps settle, sending sparks upward like tiny stars against the dark chimney. Outside, a light rain taps against the window panes, carrying the faint smell of wet cobblestones and distant Thames mud through the slightly open sash. Inside, the air holds the comforting blend of shag tobacco, old leather bindings from Holmes' reference books, and the sweet residue of brandy we shared after the arrests. Scotland Yard had summoned us that afternoon to the same small interview room where Edmund Hargrove and Miss Eliza Thorne now sat in separate cells. Inspector Lestrade, for once without his usual smugness, requested Holmes deliver the full explanation before the formal charges were read. The room felt close and overheated despite the chill seeping from the stone walls. Gas lamps hissed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the scarred wooden table. Holmes stood near the barred window, hands clasped behind his back, and began without flourish or preamble. "Gentlemen, and you, Watson, who have followed every step, the truth blazes forth now, and no darkness can survive such light." He turned first to the suicide note, holding it up so the light caught the wavering signature. Ember the first, the forged signature. Miss Thorne wrote this after the murder. The tremor in the final flourish, the exaggerated loops, the inconsistent ink pressure, all betray a hand writing under acute nervous strain. Sir Reginald's verified letters from the past year show a firm, even stroke. This one hesitates, falters, as though the writer feared discovery at every pen stroke. He set the note down and lifted a small glass vial, the remnants of the poison. Ember the second, the cyanide-laced laudanum, purchased by Edmund Hargrove in Whitechapel 3 days before the death. The sweetish residue in the glass on Sir Reginald's desk matches exactly. Administered in his evening brandy at approximately 10:15. The watch on the victim's wrist stopped at 10:17, crystal cracked from violent convulsion, not from any fall. No suicide produces such dramatic spasm unless interrupted mid-act. Edmund shifted in his chair, chains clinking softly. Miss Thorne kept her eyes fixed on the table, tears tracing silent paths down her cheeks. Holmes continued, pacing slowly before the table. Ember the third, the Whitechapel mud, reddish clay mixed with coal dust and copper filings, carried into the Mayfair library on Edmund's boots, and later on Lady Hargrove's hem when she walked there in distress after learning of the death. The same mud appeared on the carpet near the hearth, untouched by the housemaid before discovery. It proved someone from the East End entered that locked room after 10 o'clock. He paused, letting the silence stretch. Ember the fourth, the missing button, found beside the desk, its French thread still bearing chalk dust from the manuscript restoration jars on the shelves. Only Miss Thorne had regular access to that chalk. She lost the button in haste while arranging the body and forging the note, perhaps when she leaned across to bolt the door from inside before slipping out the side entrance she had left unlocked. Lestrade leaned forward. And the locked door itself? Simple, Holmes replied. Edmund entered through the side door Miss Thorne had prepared. He poisoned the brandy, waited for the convulsions to cease, then exited the same way. Miss Thorne returned minutes later, wrote the note, placed it in the dead man's hand, and bolted the main door from inside before leaving again by the side entrance, locking it behind her with her own key, which Sir Reginald had entrusted to her for correspondence duties. The ember method reached its blazing culmination. The spark. The watch stopped at 10:17, crystal cracked from convulsion, hands slightly bent from final spasm. The kindling. Cyanide acts in minutes with violent seizures. The body would slump forward, striking the desk hard enough to fracture the crystal, but not shatter it. Suicide victims do not thrash so fiercely. The flame. This recalled to me the grim affair of the Speckled Band, where a timed mechanism and a trained snake masked murder as accident. There, too, the criminal relied on precision of the moment, yet overlooked the physical evidence of struggle, the bent bell pull, the saucer of milk, the whistle piercing the night. That murderer believed science and silence would protect him. Here, Edmund and Miss Thorne believed a forged note and a locked door would suffice. Both forgot that the body itself testifies when words lie, and that small mechanical details, the crack in glass, the tremor in ink, betray more than any confession. The blaze. Sir Reginald Hargrove was murdered at 10:15 by his nephew Edmund, who administered poison in his brandy. Miss Eliza Thorne aided by leaving the side door unlocked, then forged the suicide note and staged the scene post-mortem. Motive. Greed for the inheritance, combined with a desperate, misguided love. The ember catches fire completely now. Do you see it, dear listener? Do you see the whole blaze? Lestrade exhaled slowly. Elementary, once it's laid out like that. Holmes permitted himself the rarest of smiles. Elementary indeed. Edmund stared at the table, face ashen. Miss Thorne whispered, I never wanted him to suffer. Lady Hargrove, who had been permitted to listen from an adjoining room, entered then. Her black dress rustled softly. Her eyes were dry but red-rimmed. You have given me truth, she said to Holmes, and justice will follow. Langdale, cleared beyond doubt, had already departed with quiet thanks. Annie the maid waited outside, her promotion to housekeeper now confirmed. She would testify to the whispered plans she had overheard. Holmes turned to me as we stepped into the corridor. The truth has blazed forth, he said quietly. Nothing remains hidden. I nodded, feeling the weight of the case lift like fog before dawn. The conflagration had consumed every lie, every false trail, leaving only clean ash behind. Truth blazed forth. No darkness could survive such light. Chapter 8. Ashes and Justice. The blaze of revelation had consumed its fuel by the 7th day of November 1892, leaving only clean ash and the quiet aftermath that follows any great fire. I set these lines down in my journal at 221B Baker Street, where the coal fire now burned low and steady, its warmth gentle rather than fierce. The room smelled faintly of cool tobacco ash from Holmes's pipe, the sweet residue of last night's brandy, and the crisp scent of fresh newsprint delivered that morning. Outside, a light frost had settled on the cobblestones of Baker Street. The fog had lifted entirely, revealing a pale winter sun that made the city feel strangely new. Justice moved with the deliberate pace of English law. Edmund Hargrove and Miss Eliza Thorne appeared before the magistrate at Bow Street the following morning. The courtroom was small and chill, lit by tall windows that let in grey light and the distant clatter of hansom cabs on the Strand. The air carried the familiar mixture of carbolic soap from the scrubbed floorboards, damp wool from the spectators' coats, and the metallic bite of ink from the clerk's ledger. Edmund stood in the dock first, handcuffed, his once dissolute features now haggard and pale. He wore the same tweed suit he had affected in Soho, though it hung loosely now, as though the man inside had shrunk. When the charge of murder was read, willful poisoning with intent, he stared straight ahead, offering no plea. His barrister, a thin young man hired hastily with what remained of family funds, spoke of diminished responsibility and the pressures of debt, but the evidence was overwhelming. The purchased vial, the Whitechapel mud, the stopped watch, the whispered plans Annie had overheard. The magistrate committed him for trial at the Old Bailey. Bail was refused. Miss Thorne followed. She entered the dock trembling, her smooth gloves replaced by plain cotton ones provided by the matron. Tears traced steady paths down her cheeks as the charge of being accessory before and after the fact was put to her. She pleaded guilty to the forgery and to aiding in the concealment of the crime, but insisted, voice breaking, that she had never intended murder. "I loved him," she whispered to the bench. "I believed his promises." The magistrate regarded her with something close to pity, yet the law allowed no leniency for such complicity. She too was committed for trial, though whispers among the reporters suggested transportation rather than the rope might be her fate if good behavior and remorse were shown. Lady Hargrove attended both hearings, seated in the public gallery dressed in deepest black. Her face remained composed, though her hands clasped a small black reticule so tightly that the knuckles showed white. When the proceedings ended, she approached Holmes and me outside the court, where the cold air tasted clean after the stuffy room. "You have given me more than justice, Mr. Holmes," she said quietly. "You have given me the truth of my husband's final moments. I shall not forget it." She had already begun the process of settling the estate. The rare manuscript collection, once the source of so much strife, would be donated in large part to the British Museum, with a small portion retained for her private study. The Mayfair house would be sold. She planned to remove to a smaller residence in Kensington, closer to her sister. "I wish to live quietly now," she told us. "The shadows in that library are too long." Victor Langdale sent a brief note of gratitude by messenger that afternoon. His rivalry with Sir Reginald had been genuine but confined to scholarly matters. The return of the disputed Shakespeare folio had restored peace between the families. He invited Holmes to view his own collection at some future date. When the unpleasantness has faded, Holmes folded the note with a faint smile. A red herring properly burned away leaves only ash. Annie the maid, now Mrs. Annie Burroughs, having married the under-butler at a neighboring house, came to Baker Street the next morning to express her thanks in person. Mrs. Hudson showed her up the 17 steps. She stood in our sitting room twisting her new apron nervously, though her eyes shone with quiet pride. "I've been made housekeeper proper, sir," she said. Lady Hargrove insisted, said I saw what no one else would. "And the wages?" "Well, they'll keep me comfortable." Holmes inclined his head. "You observed when others looked away, Annie. That is rarer than you think." She left with a small parcel of Mrs. Hudson's shortbread and a promise to send word if ever she needed assistance. Lestrade called later that evening, his usual briskness tempered by something like respect. He sat by the fire, accepted a glass of brandy, and raised it in a small toast. "To the science of deduction," he said gruffly. "I'll never understand how you do it, Holmes, but I'll not pretend I don't appreciate the result." Holmes merely smiled. "Data, Lestrade. Always data." As the week drew to its close, transformations settled like ash after a fire. Edmund, once hidden in the shadow of debt and dissipation, now stood fully exposed and hunted by the law. Miss Thorne, who had lived in the half-light of secret affection, burned by the truth she helped create. Lady Hargrove, long resigned to a cold marriage, emerged into a clearer dawn. wealthy, independent, and free of deception. London itself seemed to breathe easier. The fog had gone. The gas lamps burned brighter against cleaner skies. I looked across at Holmes, who lounged in his armchair, pipe drawing slowly. His face, usually so sharp with intellectual hunger, now held only quiet satisfaction. "From ashes," I said softly, "Justice rose." He nodded once, as it always must. From ashes, justice rose, as it always must. Chapter 9. Embers cool. The fire that had blazed so fiercely through the Hargrove case now burned down to quiet embers by the middle of November 1892. I record these closing observations in my journal at 221B Baker Street, where the coal fire in the grate has settled into a soft, steady glow, no longer leaping with urgent heat, but offering gentle warmth against the early winter chill. The room smells faintly of cool tobacco ash, the sweet remnant of last night's brandy, and the crisp scent of frost that drifts in whenever Mrs. Hudson opens the door to admit the morning post. Outside, the fog has vanished entirely. The sky above Baker Street is a pale, clear blue, and the cobblestones below glint with thin ice under the weak sunlight. The embers cooled slowly, one by one. Lady Hargrove had returned to her Mayfair residence only long enough to oversee the packing of Sir Reginald's manuscript collection. Most of the rare volumes, folios, illuminated psalters, Elizabethan quartos, were already crated for donation to the British Museum. She retained only a handful of personal favorites, a small book of hours that had belonged to her mother, and the Shakespeare folio over which her husband and Victor Langdale had once quarreled so bitterly. She wrote to Holmes a brief, gracious letter. "Dear Mr. Holmes, the shadows in that library have lifted at last. I shall remove to Kensington in the new year, where the air feels lighter and the rooms hold no echoes of what was done. Thank you for giving me not only justice, but the gift of knowing the truth before the grave closed over my husband. Yours in deepest gratitude, Eleanor Hargrove." Victor Langdale, his name fully cleared, sent a parcel to Baker Street 2 days later. A finely bound copy of the disputed folio, inscribed on the fly-leaf in his neat scholar's hand, to Sherlock Holmes, who saw what others missed. "May your embers always find fresh kindling." Victor Langdale. Holmes placed the volume on the shelf beside his set of criminal annals, permitting himself only the faintest of smiles. Edmund Hargrove and Miss Eliza Thorne awaited trial at the Old Bailey. The newspapers, after a week of sensational headlines, had begun to lose interest. The blaze of public curiosity had guttered out, leaving only ash. Edmund's barrister continued to argue diminished capacity, citing the crushing weight of debt and opium, but few believed the plea would sway a jury. Miss Thorne's confession, delivered in a small, trembling voice before the magistrate, had sealed her fate as accessory. Yet her genuine remorse and lack of direct intent to kill earned her whispers of sympathy among those who followed the case. Transportation to Australia seemed the likely sentence for her, rather than the rope. In time, perhaps, she might find a new life far from London's fog and gaslight. Annie Burroughs, formerly Annie the maid, had taken up her new position as housekeeper in the Kensington house Lady Hargrove intended to lease. She called at Baker Street one crisp morning, bringing a small tin of shortbread baked by her own hand. Mrs. Hudson showed her up the 17 steps. Annie stood in our sitting room, apron crisp and new, cheeks flushed from the cold walk. "I've a proper room of my own now, sir," she said, eyes shining, "and wages enough to send a bit home to my sister in Kent. Lady Hargrove says I'm to have charge of the new house when she moves. I never thought I'd rise so high." Holmes regarded her with quiet approval. "You observed when others looked away, Annie. That is the true foundation of advancement." She left with a shy curtsy and a promise to send word at Christmas. At Baker Street itself, life returned to its familiar rhythm. Holmes lounged once more in his mouse-colored dressing gown, pipe drawing slowly, the Stradivarius resting silent against the armchair. The chemical apparatus had been cleared from the table. Scattered papers were sorted into neat piles. The Persian slipper still bulged with shag tobacco, but Holmes reached for it less frequently now. The case had ignited him, and its resolution had left him in that rare state of quiet satisfaction. I looked across at him one evening as the fire settled into embers. "The mystery is illuminated," I said. "The blaze has done its work." He nodded, eyes on the glowing coals. "And now the embers cool. London breathes easier." The ember method closed softly, almost tenderly. The spark. A final letter arrived from Lady Hargrove, her signature steady, firm, free of tremor or hesitation. The kindling. Peace restored to a household once shadowed by greed and deception. The flame. This quiet aftermath recalled to me the gentle denouement of the final problem, though the tale ended in tragedy rather than justice. There, too, the fire of revelation burned through illusion, leaving only clarity in its wake. But here the blaze had saved rather than destroyed. The blaze. Truth endures, even when the flames die down. The small details, the mud, the button, the stopped watch, had led us to the heart of the matter. Once seen, they could never be unseen. The ember catches one last gentle glow. Watson, do you see how peacefully it fades? Transformations complete. The criminal, once hidden in shadow, now stood exposed and judged. The innocent, once accused or desperate, walked free in dawn clarity. The mystery itself, once cold and fog-bound, had smoldered, blazed, and finally illuminated every corner before cooling into quiet resolution. Holmes, languid and bored at the beginning, had been ignited, triumphant, and now rested satisfied. London, shrouded in fog at the start, had passed through gaslit nights of investigation and emerged into the pale clarity of winter morning. I closed my journal with a soft sigh. The case was done. No more embers demanded fanning. The embers cooled at last. London breathed easier. Chapter 10. By the fire at Baker Street. The embers of the Hargrove case had cooled to a gentle, steady glow by late November 1892. I sit now in our familiar sitting room at 221B Baker Street, the coal fire crackling softly in the grate, casting warm orange light across the worn leather chairs, the scattered newspapers, the chemical apparatus neatly stowed for once, and my friend Sherlock Holmes, who lounges in his mouse-colored dressing gown, legs stretched toward the hearth. The 17 steps to our door have been quiet these past days. No urgent knocks from Mrs. Hudson, no telegrams arriving in yellow envelopes, only the distant chime of Big Ben marking the hours, the faint clatter of hansom cabs on the frosted cobblestones below, and the soft hiss of gas lamps outside the window. Mrs. Hudson brought up a fresh pot of strong tea an hour ago. Its bitter warmth still lingers on my tongue as I set pen to paper for this final entry. Holmes has lit his pipe, the strong shag tobacco curling in slow blue spirals toward the ceiling, mingling with the faint scent of coal smoke and the clean frost that drifts in whenever we open the sash. The Persian slipper bulges on the mantel. The Stradivarius rests silent against the armchair. For once, there is no restless pacing, no sudden leap to the violin strings. The fire has done its work. A small stack of letters lies on the table between us. Notes of thanks and closure. Lady Hargrove writes from her new Kensington residence. The manuscript donation is complete. The Mayfair house sold. Her days now filled with quiet reading and charitable work among the widows of collectors. Victor Langdale has invited us to view his expanded library next month. The old rivalry is ashes, replaced by scholarly camaraderie. Annie Burroughs, now housekeeper in the Kensington house, sent a short note enclosing a tin of her shortbread and a promise to call at Christmas with her new husband. Even Lestrade dispatched a gruff telegram. Case closed. Well done. Holmes exhales a long plume of smoke and regards the fire with half-closed eyes. Observe, Watson, he says quietly, how the smallest ember, once fanned, can consume an entire edifice of lies. The tremor in a signature, a speck of Whitechapel mud, a cracked watch crystal, trifles to most men, yet they held the entire truth. I nod, setting my pen aside for a moment. I have remarked before upon your singular gifts, but never were they more apparent than in this matter. You saw the blaze before the rest of us even felt the heat. He permitted himself the ghost of a smile. The science of deduction is nothing more than trained observation. The world is full of obvious things which nobody observes. Criminals, clever or otherwise, build elaborate structures of deception, yet they forget that the ground remembers every step, that ink dries differently under guilt, that a body in its final spasm betrays more than any confession. They rely on our haste, our willingness to accept the surface. Pause, look down, fan the ember, and the shadows flee. I thought of the signature's wavering line, so small yet so damning. It reminded me of our earliest cases together. The very first time I saw you analyze handwriting, the way you read a man's character from the pressure of his pen, the angle of his loops. That skill has never failed you. Nor should it, Holmes replied. Handwriting is the unconscious signature of the soul. When fear or haste intervenes, the mask slips. In the Hargrove affair, Miss Thorne's tremor was not despair. It was terror. Edmund's footprints carried Whitechapel clay because he could not resist visiting his poison source one final time. The button bore chalk dust because proximity to forgery leaves traces no one can erase. Small details. Watson, embers. Yet from them we lit the whole truth. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, pipe bowl glowing as he drew again. The criminal mind makes one fatal error again and again. It believes itself cleverer than observation itself. They construct alibis, forge documents, lock doors, yet they overlook the mud on their boots, the crack in the crystal, the hesitation in the hand. They live in a world of grand motives, greed, love, revenge, and forget that the mundane remembers. A man may plan the perfect murder, but he cannot change the way his soul wears, the way his ink flows, the way his body convulses when poison reaches the heart. I sipped my tea, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. And yet you were languid at the beginning, bored, almost despairing of a worthy puzzle. By the end you were triumphant. Intellectual starvation is the cruelest hunger, he said. But when the spark appears, when a single detail glows against the fog, then the mind ignites. The game is afoot, the flames spread, and nothing remains hidden until the blaze dies down and the embers cool, and we sit once more by the fire, waiting for the next small glow in the darkness. Silence fell between us, broken only by the soft pop of coal settling and the distant foghorn on the Thames. Though tonight there was no fog, only clear, frosty air and stars visible above the rooftops. I looked at my friend, his profile sharp against the firelight, and felt a deep contentment. We had walked together through shadow and deception, through the gaslit streets and locked libraries of London, and emerged into clarity once again. Holmes set his pipe aside and steepled his fingers beneath his chin. Until the next ember glows, dear listener, he said softly, as though addressing not only me, but every soul who might one day read these words. The world is full of mysteries waiting to be kindled. Observe, pause, fan the flame. The game is always afoot. I closed my journal with a quiet snap. The fire burned low now, embers pulsing gently in the grate. Until the next ember glows, dear listener, the game is always afoot.